This lecture deals with the end of the Vietnam War. So when we left off, President Nixon is elected in the election of 1968. He takes office in 69, and he starts drawing home the troops. So he said in the campaign during the 1968 presidential election that he represented the silent majority, who were those individuals that did not demonstrate against the war or speak out against the government, but were generally against the war in Vietnam. And because he represents them, he's not going to do any sort of violence. He's not going to do any sort of illegal actions, but he's going to start bringing the boys home from Vietnam, getting them out of Vietnam. So his approach to Vietnam is going to be this program he calls Vietnamization, which basically means as we withdraw troops from South Vietnam, the army of the South Vietnamese will take more control of the war. We've been training them since 1954 when we had just advisors there. He says he's going to cease bombing. It's not the whole truth. He ceases bombing in Vietnam, but he starts bombing in Cambodia to cut the supply lines of the Viet Cong and the Vietnamese in the north. So again, he's kind of using half-truths. We're going to cease bombing in Vietnam, but not overall. So Vietnamization, we're going to draw down, and the South Vietnamese will take over, and we will continue bombing outside of Vietnam. This is kind of similar, speaking of synthesis, to what happens in the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, hoping that those armies, as we train them, can take over the war for themselves. So as we withdraw from the war, he starts talking about this idea of peace with honor, kind of holding your head held high as we leave. He never admits that we kind of lost the war or that we are leaving without a victory, but he says we are withdrawing and we should have peace with honor with the Vietnamese. So in Nixon's presidency during his first term in 1971, we have a former defense analyst named Daniel Ellsberg who leaks government documents regarding the war efforts during Johnson's term to the New York Times. The documents basically prove that the government misled Congress and the Americans regarding its intentions with the Vietnam War in the mid-1960s. The primary reason for fighting communism was not to eliminate it, but to avoid a humiliating defeat, especially as we talked about for the Democrats. The Democrats can't be looked down as weak, so Ellsberg releases these documents because he feels that the American people need to know the true causes of the Vietnam War. He also passes a test, or the New York Times does, when the United States sues the New York Times for libel for releasing this information. The New York Times wins, showing the First Amendment and freedom of the press is protected in these Pentagon papers. So even though it's classified information that's not necessarily shouldn't be eligible to be received by the public, the United States government or the Supreme Court says it's okay because they are releasing government documents that prove the government was misled and misled the American people. So in 1973, there was a ceasefire. The conditions were that we would remove all troops. The North Vietnamese could leave all the troops already in South Vietnam, and eventually they would resume the war. So we kind of put a pause on the war, but we allow us to leave and the North Vietnamese to stay where they were, giving them a major advantage. There's no provision for American POWs or MIA, so the last American troops leave South Vietnam on March 29, 1973, and by 1975, the North defeats the South, and it becomes one country, Vietnam, and Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, gets named Ho Chi Minh City as an allusion to their leader. So we see here as the North is conquering the South, the Americans have to abandon their embassy, a very famous picture from 1975, and you see South Vietnamese people who might have supported the Americans trying to get into the embassy, trying to get on helicopters out of Vietnam, because they are now going to be seen as traitors by the North Vietnamese as they conquer South Vietnam. So we have major costs here. There are 3 million Vietnamese people killed in this war. 58,000 Americans are killed and 300,000 are wounded. Because of the cost of the war financially, Great Society programs get underfunded. We spend over $150 billion on this war, and U.S. morale, self-confidence, and trust in government are completely decimated, especially after we learn about the events of the Pentagon Papers and what they tell us about the whole causes of the war and the truthfulness of the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. So massive costs on both sides, and it's America's kind of most interesting war, not necessarily most interesting, but most controversial war, because if you look at just numbers of casualties, it looks like we won, compared to the Vietnamese, but we don't win in our objective of stopping communism from spreading. And we talked about the problems from the beginning with no territorial goals. And if there's one communist left in Vietnam, if we conquered Vietnam, then that you could argue that communism was still winning. So we have massive impacts here socially. We get the 26th Amendment, which said 18-year-olds could vote. Prior to that, it was determined by state, and it was more likely that you had to be 21 to be able to vote. So we figured if 18-year-olds can be drafted, they should be able to vote as well. Nixon abolishes the draft, not completely, but he wants an all-volunteer army. So it's not, the draft legally still exists, but it's not going to be used. We get the War Powers Act in 1973 that the president must notify Congress within 48 hours of deploying military force, and he must withdraw any forces unless he gains congressional approval within 90 days. So again, this kind of goes back to, it's not a declaration of war. We don't do that anymore. It's this whole, we can kind of go in for 90 days with congressional approval or without congressional approval. 91 days we need congressional approval, but not a declaration of war. We disregard the veterans. As we said, they are kind of seen as baby killers, and the POW MIA issue lingers. We don't know what happens to a lot of people in the Vietnam War, and the American government doesn't do much for these people as we withdraw. So we still have about 2,500 American POWs and MIA that are still accounted for from the Vietnam War. We also have some serious lessons for American precedents. Wars must be of short duration, even though we don't necessarily listen to that in Iraq and Afghanistan. That's something that George W. Bush didn't necessarily listen to. We must yield few American casualties. That generally has been followed. We try to restrict media access to battlefields so that the American people only get kind of the information we want them to have. They develop and maintain congressional and public support. You have to have public support for a war, otherwise it's not going to be successful. Set clear, winnable goals. Again, we'll see this in Iraq and Afghanistan. That doesn't necessarily happen. And set a deadline for troop withdrawal so we know that this war will be coming to an end. And we see some still lasting scars from this. Vietnam is not officially recognized as a country until 1995, so it takes us 20 years to even recognize that the country of Vietnam exists. And this obviously has a clear comparison to the issues in Iraq, where it starts in 2003. It's basically been drawn down by about 2011, 2014, but we're still there now with ISIS and things like that. There's at least 2,400 American dead and counting. So is this kind of turning into a modern version of Vietnam? It kind of already has, but we'll see if it has a different outcome. So you can see some clear synthesis there.